The world blurred around me, lights flashing as the sound of sirens pierced the air. I could hear the paramedics speaking in clipped tones, their words a haze of medical jargon as they worked quickly to stabilize me. My chest ached with a tightness I couldn't explain, every breath shallow and strained. "Stay with us, Nathan," one of them said, his voice steady but urgent. I nodded weakly, trying to focus on anything other than the pounding in my chest. As the ambulance swerved onto the main road, my phone buzzed in the pocket of my jacket, which one of the paramedics had placed beside me. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it. Who could possibly matter in this moment? But something made me motion toward it. "Do you need me to grab that?" the paramedic asked, noticing my gesture. I nodded. "It's my wife," I said hoarsely as the screen lit up with her name, Olivia. The paramedic handed me the phone, and I swiped to answer, struggling to bring it to my ear. "Olivia?" I managed, my voice weak. "What's going on, Nathan?" Her tone was sharp, impatient. "I just got a call saying you're in an ambulance. Are you seriously causing all this drama again?" Drama. The word hung in the air, cutting through the chaos around me. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, but her words only made the tightness in my chest worse. "Olivia," I said, each word a struggle. "This isn't drama. I can barely breathe." She let out an exasperated sigh. "You're always so dramatic, Nathan. If you just take better care of yourself, maybe we wouldn't be dealing with this. Honestly, do you have any idea how inconvenient this is?" The paramedic's eyes flicked toward me, his brow furrowing in concern. I could feel my cheeks flush, not from the medical emergency, but from the humiliation of Olivia's words. Even in my weakest moment, she found a way to make it about herself. "Olivia," I said, forcing as much strength into my voice as I could muster, "I'm on my way to the hospital. My chest feels like it's in a vice. But thank you for reminding me just how much you care." She started to say something, but I didn't let her finish. For once, I wasn't going to sit there and absorb her venom. "I'll call you if I need you," I said, and hung up before she could respond. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sirens, the weight of her indifference settling over me like a lead blanket. One of the paramedics, a younger woman with kind eyes, spoke softly. "You don't need that kind of stress right now, sir. Let us take care of you." Her words, though meant to be reassuring, hit a nerve. Stress. That word seemed to follow me everywhere, the invisible thread tying together every interaction I had with Olivia lately. By the time we reached the hospital, my mind was racing, despite my body's exhaustion. As the nurses wheeled me into the emergency room, I couldn't stop replaying the call in my head. Olivia's dismissiveness, her complete lack of concern, felt like a gut punch. Not because it was unexpected, but because it wasn't. This wasn't the first time she had dismissed my feelings or belittled my struggles. It was just the most glaring example of a pattern I had been too blind or too hopeful to fully acknowledge. Hours later, as I lay in a hospital bed hooked up to monitors, I stared at the ceiling, the beeping of the machines the only sound in the room. The doctors had stabilized me, run their tests, and assured me that I would be fine with rest and a few lifestyle adjustments. But as I lay there, Olivia's voice echoed in my mind. "You're always so dramatic, Nathan." Was she right? Had I been overreacting, reading too much into her words and actions? Or was this moment, the complete absence of empathy from the person who was supposed to love and support me, proof that something was deeply wrong? For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that it wasn't just me. Maybe Olivia's indifference wasn't a reflection of my shortcomings, but of hers. Maybe the problem wasn't that I was dramatic or too sensitive, but that she lacked the capacity to care in the way I deserved. That thought stayed with me as the night wore on, growing louder with each passing hour. For the first time in years, I stopped making excuses for her behavior. Instead, I began asking questions, hard, uncomfortable questions about our relationship and whether it was worth the toll it was taking on me. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor and the occasional shuffle of nurses outside the door. Lying in that bed, staring up at the ceiling tiles, I couldn't stop the flood of memories. They came unbidden, like an old movie reel, replaying the highlights and lowlights of my marriage to Olivia. There was a time when things were good between us, or at least I thought they were. I could still picture the early days. The way her eyes lit up when we laughed together, the effortless way we fit into each other's lives. She had been my biggest cheerleader when I started my business, always there with a smile and words of encouragement. Back then, she made me feel like I could conquer the world. But somewhere along the way, things shifted. The Olivia I fell in love with slowly faded, replaced by someone sharper, colder. At first, it was subtle, offhand comments that stung more than they should have, moments when her support felt conditional. I brushed them off, convincing myself it was stress or a bad day. We all have our moments, right? But the moments turned into patterns. Her dismissiveness became more frequent, her sharp remarks cutting deeper. Whenever I brought up my concerns, she would wave them off with a casual, "You're overthinking things," or "Don't be so sensitive." Over time, I stopped bringing them up at all. I could pinpoint the exact moment when the doubts started to creep in. It was our 5th anniversary. I had planned a surprise dinner at her favorite restaurant, complete with flowers and a handwritten note that I spent hours perfecting. But when I handed her the note, hoping to rekindle the connection we once had, she barely glanced at it before setting it aside. "That's sweet," she had said, her tone flat, almost bored. "But you really didn't need to go through all this trouble." The disappointment in her voice had hit me like a slap. What was supposed to be a celebration of our love felt more like an obligation she couldn't wait to be done with. That night, as I lay awake beside her, I wondered for the first time if we were on different paths. Now, lying in that hospital bed, those moments played in a loop, each one a reminder of how far we drifted. The call from the ambulance only solidified what I had been too afraid to admit. Olivia didn't see me the way I saw her. What I thought was love and partnership had become one-sided, a toxic dynamic that was slowly draining me. I thought back to all the times I had stayed late at work to give her the lifestyle she wanted. The vacations, the home renovations, the endless stream of gifts, all meant to show her how much I cared. And yet, nothing ever seemed to be enough. Every effort I made felt like pouring water into a bottomless pit. It wasn't just the big moments either. It was the small ones, the ones that should have been easy. Asking how my day was, showing concern when I was stressed, or even just listening without judgment. Those moments, once so natural between us, had disappeared entirely. A soft knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. A nurse stepped in, her smile kind and professional. "How are you feeling, Mr. Taylor?" "Better," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Physically, I was improving. Emotionally, I felt like I was unraveling. "Good to hear," she said, adjusting the four. "Your vitals are stabilizing, but I'd recommend avoiding stress as much as possible. It's a key factor in these kinds of episodes." Stress. There it was again, the word that seemed to define my life lately. As the nurse left, I couldn't help but wonder. How much of this stress was tied to Olivia? How much of my health and my happiness? Had I sacrificed trying to make a relationship work with someone who didn't seem to care? The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about Olivia's indifference during my medical emergency. It was about years of feeling unseen, unappreciated, and unsupported. I had spent so much time trying to fix things, trying to be the husband I thought she wanted, that I had lost sight of myself. For the first time, I let myself consider a terrifying question. What if this marriage wasn't salvageable? What if the only way to find peace was to let go? The thought made my chest tighten, but it also brought a strange sense of relief. The weight of trying to hold everything together had been crushing me, and the idea of setting it down, even for a moment, felt like the first deep breath I'd taken in years. That night, as I closed my eyes, I made a promise to myself. I wasn't going to make any rash decisions, but I also wasn't going to ignore the truth any longer. Something had to change. Whether that meant fixing the marriage or walking away, I didn't know yet. But one thing was certain. I couldn't keep living like this. The doctor's office was quiet, the kind of quiet that made you acutely aware of your own breathing. I sat on the edge of the examination table, fidgeting with the hem of the thin hospital gown they'd given me, waiting for the doctor to return with my test results. The minutes felt like hours, each one stretching out in agonizing silence. When Dr. Patel finally entered, her face was calm but serious, the kind of expression doctors must practice to keep their patients from panicking. She carried a clipboard and a tablet, her movements deliberate as she sat across from me. "Well, Nathan," she began, glancing at the clipboard before meeting my eyes, "the good news is that your tests didn't reveal anything immediately life-threatening. Your heart is fine, and there's no indication of any major blockages or structural issues." Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived as her tone shifted. "However," she continued, her voice firm, "your blood pressure is elevated. Your cortisol levels are through the roof, and there are clear signs that stress is taking a significant toll on your body." I nodded slowly, bracing myself for the advice I knew was coming. "You've had what we call a stress-induced hypertensive episode," Dr. Patel explained. "It's your body's way of waving a red flag and saying something needs to change." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. "Something needs to change. I've seen cases like yours before," she said, her tone softening. "Stress doesn't just affect your mind. It impacts your entire body. If you don't address it, these episodes could become more frequent and more dangerous." I swallowed hard, the weight of her warning sinking in. "So what do I do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You need to identify the sources of your stress and take steps to manage them," she said, her gaze steady. "That might mean making some tough decisions, Nathan, but your health and your life depends on it." I nodded, unable to form a coherent response. As she went on to outline a plan for managing my stress, medication, a healthier diet, exercise, and possibly therapy, I could barely focus. My mind was stuck on one thing: the source of my stress. I didn't need a therapist or a self-help book to tell me what or who was at the center of it all. Olivia. Her dismissive words during the ambulance ride replayed in my head like a broken record. "You're so dramatic, Nathan." The memory felt like a dagger, twisting deeper with every repetition. As I left the doctor's office and walked to my car, her warning echoed in my mind. Something needs to change. The words felt like a challenge, daring me to confront the reality I had been avoiding for years. When I got home, I collapsed onto the couch, my body still weary from the episode. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, and I hesitated before picking it up. It was a text from Olivia. "Hope you're out of the hospital. Don't forget we have that dinner with the Fergusons next week. Try to be in a better mood by then." I stared at the message, disbelief mingling with a simmering anger. No question about how I was feeling. No acknowledgement of the seriousness of what had happened. Just another reminder of how little she cared. For years, I had convinced myself that her indifference was temporary, a phase we could work through. But now, with my health and my life on the line, I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. Olivia wasn't just indifferent. She was toxic. And her toxicity was slowly destroying me. I thought about the times I had bent over backward to make her happy, the countless ways I had tried to prove my worth. I had sacrificed my time, my energy, and now, my health, all for someone who couldn't even muster a shred of empathy during a medical emergency. The realization hit me like a freight train. If I stayed in this marriage, I wasn't just sacrificing my happiness. I was sacrificing my future, my well-being, my life. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. I didn't know exactly what the path forward would look like, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep living like this. Whether it meant setting boundaries, seeking counseling, or walking away entirely, I needed to take action. Olivia's dismissive text continued over the next few days, each one solidifying my resolve. She complained about the canceled dinner plans, asked why I was being so distant, and even accused me of being overly sensitive. But for the first time, her words didn't cut as deeply. They didn't have the power they once did. The wake-up call I'd received wasn't just about my health. It was about my life, my choices, and the realization that I deserved better. I deserved to be loved and supported, not dismissed and belittled. And if Olivia wasn't willing or capable of being that person, then it was time for me to start prioritizing myself. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope that change was possible. Hope that I could find peace and happiness, even if it meant walking a difficult road. The days after my hospital stay felt like a strange limbo. I was physically recovering but emotionally raw, caught between moments of clarity and waves of doubt. It was during one of these moments, when the weight of everything felt too much, that I called Caleb. Caleb and I had been best friends since college, a bond forged over late-night study sessions, bad coffee, and a shared sense of humor that could cut through even the darkest days. Over the years, he had become more than a friend. He was my sounding board, my confidant, the person who always gave it to me straight. "Hey, man," I said when he answered, my voice betraying the exhaustion I felt. "You got a minute?" "For you?" "Always," he replied without hesitation. "What's going on?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. How do you even begin to explain years of feeling invisible, of being worn down piece by someone who's supposed to love you? Finally, I just said, "Can we talk in person?" "It's a lot." "Say no more," he said. "Come over. I'll grab the whiskey." By the time I arrived at Caleb's place, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. He greeted me at the door with a concerned expression and a firm clap on the shoulder. "You look like hell," he said bluntly, but there was warmth in his eyes. "Come in." We settled into his living room, 2 glasses of whiskey between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes from years of friendship, the kind that says, "Take your time." Finally, I took a deep breath and started talking. I told him everything. The ambulance ride, Olivia's coldness, the doctor's warning, and the endless texts that made it clear she still didn't understand or care about what I was going through. As I spoke, Caleb listened intently, his expression shifting between concern, frustration, and something I could only describe as protective anger. When I finished, he leaned back, letting out a low whistle. "Damn, Nate. That's a lot." I nodded, staring into my glass. "Yeah." Caleb was quiet for a moment, then leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Look, I've held my tongue about Olivia for years because I didn't want to overstep. But after hearing all that, man, she's toxic." I glanced at him, surprised by his bluntness. "You really think so?" "I don't think so, I know so," he said firmly. "I've seen how she talks to you, how she makes everything about herself. And now, knowing how she handled your health scare, that's not just toxic, Nate. That's dangerous." His words hit harder than I expected. Hearing someone else say it out loud, someone I trusted, made it all feel more real. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I feel trapped." "You're not trapped," Caleb said, his tone unwavering. "You've got options. You just need to take the first step." I looked at him, searching for some sign of judgment or impatience, but all I saw was empathy. "What step? Divorce? Therapy? Moving out? It all feels impossible." "It's not impossible," he said. "It's hard, yeah. But you've been carrying this weight alone for so long, and you don't have to. You've got me, Nate. Whatever you decide, I'll be here." The sincerity in his voice brought a lump to my throat. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't drowning. I wasn't alone. "You can stay here if you need to," Caleb continued. "Take some time, get some space. Figure out what you want without her voice in your head." The offer caught me off guard. "I can't just leave," I said, though even as I said it, the idea felt like a lifeline. "Why not?" he challenged. "She's not going to change, Nate. You've been waiting for her to suddenly wake up and treat you the way you deserve, but it's not going to happen. Staying is just dragging you down." I didn't have a response to that. He was right, and I knew it. As the evening wore on, we talked more about the logistics of leaving, the emotional toll it would take, and the small steps I could start taking to protect myself. Caleb didn't push. He listened, offered advice, and reminded me that I wasn't as alone as I felt. By the time I left his house, a plan had started to form in my mind. It wasn't fully fleshed out, and it wasn't going to be easy, but it was a start. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a way forward. That night, as I lay in bed, Olivia's texts pinged on my phone. I didn't bother reading them. Instead, I stared at the ceiling, Caleb's words replaying in my head. You're not trapped. You've got options. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe it. It was late afternoon when Olivia finally decided to show up at the hospital. I'd been discharged the day before, but had to return for a follow-up appointment. I was sitting in the hospital cafeteria, sipping a bland cup of coffee and waiting for my doctor when I saw her walk in, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She looked immaculate, as always, perfectly tailored dress, hair styled just so, her phone in one hand and a designer bag in the other. But her expression? That was pure annoyance, like she was here out of obligation rather than concern. "Nathan," she said, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the room. "Why didn't you tell me you were still at the hospital? Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is to hear it from someone else?" I stared at her, dumbfounded. Embarrassing? That was her concern? "I didn't think you'd care," I said flatly, setting my coffee down. "You've made it pretty clear how you feel about all this." She sighed dramatically, sliding into the chair across from me. "Oh, don't start with that. I'm here, aren't I? What more do you want from me?" What more do I want? The words echoed in my mind, each one stoking the fire of frustration and anger that had been building inside me for weeks. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I want you to care," I said, meeting her gaze. "I want you to show even an ounce of empathy instead of acting like my health is some kind of inconvenience for you." She rolled her eyes, leaning back in her chair. "Nathan, you're blowing this way out of proportion. You're fine. The doctors said so, didn't they? So why are we still talking about this?" I stared at her, struggling to process her complete lack of accountability. "Do you even hear yourself?" I asked, my voice rising slightly. "You're dismissing everything. My health, my feelings, everything I've been through, as if it's nothing." "It is nothing," she snapped, her voice sharp. "You're making a big deal out of something that didn't even matter in the end. You're fine. You just love playing the victim." That was it. The breaking point. I leaned forward, my hands resting on the table, and spoke in a low, steady voice. "Olivia, do you know what the doctors told me? They said the stress in my life is killing me. Literally. And do you want to know the biggest source of that stress?" She opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't give her the chance. "It's you, Olivia. It's your indifference, your constant criticism, your complete inability to see beyond yourself. You are the reason I'm sitting in a hospital cafeteria right now instead of living my life." Her eyes widened, the shock on her face almost comical. "Are you blaming me for your health problems?" she demanded, her voice incredulous. "I'm holding you accountable for the part you've played," I said firmly. "And I'm done pretending it's okay. I've spent years trying to make you happy, bending over backward to meet your expectations, and all it's done is wear me down. Well, I'm done, Olivia. I'm done trying to be good enough for someone who doesn't even care." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in our marriage, Olivia didn't have a snappy comeback or a dismissive remark. She just sat there, staring at me as if I were a stranger. Finally, she stood, smoothing her dress with shaky hands. "I don't have to listen to this," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and something else, maybe fear. "If you're so unhappy, Nathan, then maybe we need to reevaluate this marriage." I nodded, my chest tightening, but not with fear or sadness. It was relief. Pure, unfiltered relief. "You're right," I said. "We do." She hesitated for a moment, as if she were waiting for me to take it back, to apologize, to beg her to stay. But I didn't. I just sat there, watching her, waiting for her to make her next move. When she finally turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the tile, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. For so long, I had been afraid to stand up to her, to risk upsetting the fragile balance of our relationship. But now, as I sat alone in that cafeteria, I realized that balance had been an illusion. There was no partnership, no equality. There was only me, holding everything together while she tore it apart. As I left the hospital later that day, I felt lighter. The path ahead was still uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let Olivia, or anyone else, diminish my worth again. The first thing I did when I got home from the hospital was sit at my desk and open a blank notebook. It was late, the kind of late where the world is quiet and your thoughts feel louder than usual. I stared at the page for a long time, the pen in my hand hovering above the paper. Where do you even begin to document the unraveling of a marriage? Eventually, I wrote the first line, "This is not my fault." It felt almost silly to write it down, but I needed to see those words in black and white. For years, Olivia had made me feel like every problem in our relationship was my doing, like I wasn't good enough, attentive enough, or successful enough. But now, after everything, I knew better. Once I got started, the words came faster than I expected. I began listing every instance I could remember when Olivia's behavior had crossed the line from dismissive to outright harmful. The cutting remarks, the emotional manipulation, the times she'd mocked me in front of others or brushed off my concerns as overreacting. Each memory felt like a wound reopening, but I kept writing, determined to get it all down. The next morning, I called Caleb. "I need your help," I said, skipping the usual small talk. "Whatever you need," he replied without hesitation. I explained my plan. I was going to consult a lawyer to explore my options for separating from Olivia, but first, I needed to gather as much evidence as possible to support my case. Caleb listened carefully, his steady presence grounding me as I laid out the details. "Start with the financials," he suggested. "If she's been controlling the money or spending recklessly, that's going to be important. And document every conversation you have with her from now on. Texts, emails, everything." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Got it. Thanks, man." The next few days were a blur of sorting through old bank statements, emails, and receipts. I felt like a detective piecing together a puzzle, each piece revealing another layer of the dysfunction that had become my life with Olivia. There were expenses I couldn't explain, lavish dinners at restaurants I'd never been to, shopping sprees at high-end stores, even a weekend getaway charged to my credit card that I hadn't known about. Seeing it all laid out in front of me was both infuriating and liberating. For so long, I had questioned myself, wondering if I was the problem. But the evidence told a different story. Caleb came over one evening to help me organize everything. We spread the documents across the dining table, grouping them into categories: financial discrepancies, text messages that highlighted her dismissiveness, and a timeline of events that showed the gradual erosion of our relationship. "This is solid," Caleb said, scanning the neatly organized files. "You've got a strong case here." I nodded, though my chest felt tight. "It's just a lot," I admitted. "Looking at all this, seeing how bad it's been, it's overwhelming." "It's supposed to be," Caleb said, his tone gentle but firm. "You've been carrying this weight for years, Nate. Facing it head-on is going to hurt, but it's the only way to move forward." The next step was meeting with a lawyer. I scheduled a consultation with Ms. Clark, a no-nonsense divorce attorney who came highly recommended. Sitting across from her in her sleek, minimalist office, I laid out everything I had gathered. She listened intently, her pen flying across a legal pad as I spoke. When I finished, she looked up, her expression both professional and sympathetic. "You've done an excellent job documenting everything," she said. "This kind of evidence is invaluable in cases like yours, especially if you're seeking a favorable settlement. But I have to ask, are you ready for what comes next? Divorce is never easy, even when it's the right choice." I hesitated, the weight of her question settling over me. Was I ready? I thought about the years of emotional neglect, the toll it had taken on my health, and the moment in the hospital cafeteria when I had finally stood up to Olivia. "Yes," I said firmly. "I'm ready." Ms. Clark nodded, her demeanor shifting into action mode. "Then let's get started. We'll file the initial paperwork and prepare for any pushback from her side. With what you've shown me, I'm confident we can build a strong case." As I left her office, a strange mix of emotions swirled within me. Relief, fear, and a faint glimmer of hope. This was the beginning of the end, but it was also the beginning of something new, a life where I could finally breathe again. That evening, as I reviewed the notes Ms. Clark had given me, Olivia sent another text. "Are you coming home for dinner, or are you going to keep ignoring me?" I stared at the message for a long moment before typing a reply. "I'll be home soon, but we need to talk. Her response was immediate. Ugh, more drama? I didn't reply. Instead, I closed my phone and leaned back in my chair, the weight of the decision ahead pressing down on me. I wasn't sure what the conversation with Olivia would bring, but I knew one thing. I wasn't the same man I had been. I was no longer afraid to stand up for myself. This time, I wasn't backing down. The first thing I noticed after my confrontation with Olivia was the quiet. Not the oppressive silence that had settled over my marriage, but a calm, liberating stillness that seemed to fill the spaces she once dominated. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking on eggshells, constantly anticipating her next criticism or dismissive remark. I moved into Caleb's apartment a week after the lawyer filed the initial divorce paperwork. It was a modest place, cozy, with mismatched furniture and a perpetual scent of takeout, but it felt like a sanctuary. Caleb had cleared out the spare bedroom for me, and while it wasn't much, it was mine. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," he said the night I arrived, handing me a beer as we sat on his worn-out couch. "This is your reset button, man. Use it." And I did. The first few days felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life. I'd wake up in the unfamiliar bed, disoriented, and then remember, I was free. There were no pointed glares waiting for me in the kitchen, no passive-aggressive remarks about my schedule or my habits. Just me, the sound of Caleb's clumsy attempts at cooking, and the realization that I could finally breathe. It wasn't long before I started rediscovering pieces of myself I had forgotten. Small things, like taking morning runs through the neighborhood or making coffee the way I liked it, strong, with just a splash of cream. I even dusted off my old guitar, an impulse buy from years ago that had spent more time in storage than in my hands. "Didn't know you played," Caleb remarked one evening as I strummed aimlessly on the couch. "I don't really," I admitted with a laugh. "But it's nice to try again." That became my mantra, trying again. I started reconnecting with old friends, people I had drifted away from during my marriage. At first, I felt awkward reaching out, unsure if they'd even want to hear from me after all this time. But to my surprise, they welcomed me back with open arms. "Man, we've missed you," Mark, an old college buddy, said over drinks one night. "It's like you disappeared after you got married." I nodded, the truth of his words hitting me harder than I expected. "I think I did," I said quietly, "but I'm trying to change that." Rebuilding those connections felt like watering a withered plant, each conversation bringing a little more life back into me. As the weeks passed, I also began tackling the hobbies and passions I had abandoned. I joined a local hiking group, something I'd always wanted to do but never made time for. The physical exertion was therapeutic, each step on the trail grounding me in the present moment. One Saturday, as I stood on the edge of a cliff overlooking a vast expanse of forest, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in years. The air was crisp, the sun warm on my face, and for the first time in a long time, I felt alive. Caleb noticed the change, too. "You're like a whole different person," he said one evening as we sat on the balcony, nursing beers. "I feel different," I admitted. I didn't realize how much of myself I'd lost until I started getting it back. "You deserve this, Nate," he said. "Don't let anyone take it away from you again." His words stuck with me. For so long, I had let Olivia's voice drown out my own, her expectations shaping every decision I made. But now, I was finally listening to myself. That clarity extended to my work as well. With Olivia no longer siphoning my energy, I found myself more focused and productive. Projects that had once felt overwhelming now felt manageable, even exciting. My colleagues noticed, too, commenting on the newfound enthusiasm I brought to the office. "You've been killing it lately," my boss said during a meeting. "Keep it up." The praise felt good, but it was more than that. It felt earned. I wasn't just going through the motions anymore. I was showing up for myself in ways I hadn't in years. Of course, not every day was easy. There were moments when doubt crept in, whispering that I was making a mistake, that maybe I should have tried harder to make things work with Olivia. But those moments were fleeting, quickly replaced by the growing realization that I was on the right path. One afternoon, while sorting through some old boxes Caleb had stored for me, I found a photo of myself from years ago. I was sitting on the hood of my first car, grinning at the camera with an ease I barely recognized. It was a snapshot of a time when I knew who I was before life and Olivia had chipped away at that confidence. I stared at the photo for a long time, a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "Welcome back," I whispered to myself. That night, I hung the photo on the wall of my room, a reminder of the person I was fighting to become again. As I lay in bed, the sounds of the city filtering through the open window, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. I wasn't fully healed, and the road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, I believed in the possibility of a better future. A future where I could live on my own terms, surrounded by people who lifted me up instead of tearing me down. It happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. I was in Caleb's living room, sorting through some paperwork for my lawyer, when my phone buzzed on the coffee table. Olivia's name flashed across the screen, and for a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. But something in me, the part that wanted closure, made me pick up. "Hello?" I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Nathan," she began, her voice tight. "We need to talk." I leaned back against the couch, bracing myself. "I'm listening." There was a pause, the sound of rain filling the silence. "Finally," she said, "what are you trying to do? Ruin my life?" I frowned, confused. "Excuse me?" "This divorce," she snapped. "You're making things so difficult. Do you even care about what you're doing to me? To us?" I let out a bitter laugh. "Us? Olivia, there hasn't been an us for a long time. And if anyone's made this difficult, it's you. You're blowing everything out of proportion," she said, her voice growing defensive. "We had problems, sure, but every couple does. You didn't have to go nuclear." "Nuclear?" I repeated, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Olivia, do you even hear yourself? You dismissed me, belittled me, and ignored me for years. You pushed me to the edge, and now that I'm finally standing up for myself, I'm the bad guy?" "You're overreacting," she said, her tone condescending. "I thought we could work through this, but apparently you're more interested in playing the victim." And there it was, the familiar refrain, the narrative she'd spun for years. But this time, it didn't sting the way it used to. This time, I saw it for what it was: manipulation. "Olivia," I said, my voice steady, "this isn't about playing the victim. This is about survival. My survival. Because being with you was slowly killing me. Physically, emotionally, and mentally." She scoffed. "That's dramatic, even for you." "No, it's the truth," I shot back. "You can't stand that I'm finally calling you out, can you? You can't handle the fact that I'm no longer bending over backward to make you happy at my own expense." Her silence was deafening, but I wasn't done. "You want to talk about difficult?" I continued. "Let's talk about how difficult it was to watch you dismiss my feelings over and over again. Let's talk about how difficult it was to constantly question my own worth because the person who was supposed to love me couldn't even show basic empathy. Let's talk about how difficult it was to lie in a hospital bed, wondering if I'd ever feel like myself again, while you texted me about dinner plans." The words spilled out of me, years of pent-up frustration and pain finally finding their voice. And for once, Olivia didn't interrupt. When I finished, the silence on the other end of the line was almost suffocating. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter than before. "I didn't realize you felt that way." I laughed bitterly. "That's the problem, Olivia. You never realize. And even if you do, you don't care enough to do anything about it." "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said, her tone almost remorseful, "but I wasn't falling for it." "Maybe not," I said, "but intention doesn't erase impact. And the impact of being with you has been devastating." She sighed, a long, drawn-out sound that was more frustration than regret. "So what now?" "What now?" I repeated, leaning forward, "is that I'm filing for divorce. Officially. I've already started the process, and nothing you say is going to change that." "Nathan, be reasonable," she said, her voice climbing in pitch. "We can fix this. We can." "No, Olivia," I interrupted, my voice firm. "We can't. Because this isn't something you can fix with half-hearted apologies and empty promises. This is over." The finality of those words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. For the first time, I felt a sense of closure, a line drawn in the sand that I wasn't willing to cross. "You'll regret this," she said after a long pause, her tone venomous. "You'll see." "Maybe," I said simply, "but I'd rather regret leaving than regret staying." With that, I ended the call and set my phone down, my hands trembling slightly. I expected to feel a rush of guilt or doubt, but instead, there was only relief. Pure, unadulterated relief. Caleb walked in a few minutes later, a sandwich in one hand and a curious look on his face. "You good?" he asked, noticing my expression. I nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "Yeah, I think I am." That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the conversation in my mind. For the first time, I hadn't let Olivia control the narrative. I had stood my ground, spoken my truth, and taken the first real step toward reclaiming my life. It wasn't easy, and I knew there would be more challenges ahead. But for the first time, I felt like I was walking in the right direction, toward freedom, healing, and a life where I was finally enough. Moving out of the house felt surreal. The physical act of packing up my belongings, clothes, books, framed photos, felt like pulling roots out of the ground, one by one. Each item I placed in a box was a reminder of what I had built, what I had endured, and what I was finally leaving behind. Caleb had cleared a corner of his apartment for me, insisting that I take my time to settle in. "No rush," he said as we carried the last box up the stairs. "This is your space now." I nodded, my chest tightening with gratitude. I had expected to feel a sense of loss or regret as I left my home, but instead, there was only relief. For the first time in years, I wasn't tethered to Olivia's criticism or the weight of her indifference. The air in Caleb's apartment felt lighter, freer, like I could finally exhale. The first night in my new space, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared out the window. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to imagine what my life could look like now. No more tiptoeing around Olivia's moods. No more shrinking myself to fit into her version of who I should be. Just me. The next morning, I started a routine. I woke up early, laced up my running shoes, and hit the pavement. The cold morning air stung my lungs, but the rhythmic pounding of my feet against the ground was cathartic. With every mile, I felt a little stronger, a little more in control of my own narrative. Caleb noticed the change almost immediately. "You're like a new person," he said one evening as we cooked dinner together, a surprisingly therapeutic activity I hadn't enjoyed in years. "I feel like one," I admitted. "It's like I can finally think clearly." But it wasn't just about feeling better physically. I knew I needed to address the emotional scars Olivia had left behind. At Caleb's urging, I started therapy, a step I had resisted for far too long. My therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Lawson, had a way of peeling back layers I didn't even realize I had. During one session, she asked, "Nathan, what do you think it means to be happy?" The question caught me off guard. I sat in silence for what felt like an eternity before finally answering. "I don't know. I think it means being at peace, not constantly feeling like I'm not enough." Her nod was encouraging. "And do you feel like you're finding that peace now?" I thought about it, about the morning runs, the laughter with Caleb, the freedom to simply exist without judgment. "I think I am," I said quietly. Therapy became a lifeline, a place where I could unpack years of self-doubt and rebuild my sense of self-worth. I started to see patterns, how Olivia's behavior had mirrored dynamics from my past, how I had fallen into the trap of trying to fix someone who didn't want to be fixed. It wasn't an easy process, but with each session, I felt a little lighter. Outside of therapy, I focused on rebuilding my life. Work became a source of pride again, a place where I could channel my energy and creativity. My colleagues noticed the change, too, commenting on my renewed enthusiasm and focus. But perhaps the most unexpected source of healing was the community I found through Caleb. His friends welcomed me into their circle without hesitation, pulling me into weekend hikes, game nights, and impromptu dinners. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged, not because of what I could provide, but simply because of who I was. One evening, as we sat around a fire pit in Caleb's backyard, one of his friends, Sarah, turned to me and said, "You seem lighter, happier." I smiled, the warmth of the fire reflecting my mood. "I think I am," I admitted. "It's been a long time coming." There were still hard days, of course. The divorce proceedings were messy, with Olivia dragging her feet at every turn. She sent angry emails, made passive-aggressive comments during mediation, and tried to guilt me into reconsidering. But each time, I stood my ground, reminding myself of the life I was building and the freedom I was fighting for. By the time the paperwork was finalized, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, yes, but also a quiet sense of pride. I had survived. I had walked away from something that was breaking me and had found the strength to start over. That evening, Caleb and I celebrated with pizza and beer, a simple but perfect way to mark the occasion. As we clinked our bottles together, he grinned. "To freedom," he said. "To healing," I added. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. It hadn't been easy, and I knew the road ahead wouldn't be without challenges. But for the first time in years, I felt hopeful. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living. And as I drifted off to sleep, the city lights twinkling outside the window, I felt a deep, unshakable peace. The first morning after the divorce was finalized, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the blinds and a profound sense of stillness. It wasn't just the physical quiet of Caleb's apartment or the absence of Olivia's sharp remarks. It was a deeper silence, the kind that came with knowing you'd finally put something heavy behind you. I sat on the edge of the bed, letting the moment sink in. For years, I'd lived under the weight of expectations, both spoken and unspoken. But now, that weight was gone. What lay ahead was uncharted territory, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. The day unfolded like any other. I brewed coffee, laced up my running shoes, and hit the pavement. But something was different. Each step felt lighter, freer, like I wasn't just running to clear my head. I was running towards something new. When I got back, Caleb was in the kitchen, flipping pancakes with a level of focus that suggested he was trying to redeem himself from his usual culinary disasters. He looked up as I walked in, a grin spreading across his face. "Morning, Mr. Freeman," he said, handing me a plate. I chuckled, taking a seat at the counter. "Morning. Pancakes, huh? What's the occasion?" He shrugged. "Thought we'd celebrate. You've officially shed the ball and chain." I smirked, shaking my head. "Thanks, man. Really." As we ate, Caleb started rattling off ideas for how I could celebrate this new chapter. Everything from taking a solo trip to joining a skydiving class. "You've got a clean slate now," he said. "The world's your oyster." It was a cliché, but it rang true. The world did feel open in a way it hadn't before. And while I wasn't quite ready to jump out of a plane, the idea of exploring life on my own terms was exhilarating. That afternoon, I took the first step by visiting the community center Caleb had been telling me about for weeks. He'd mentioned they were looking for volunteers for a mentorship program, and while I was initially hesitant, something about the idea resonated with me. Walking into the center, I was greeted by a warm, bustling energy. Kids and teens filled the space, some playing basketball in the gym while others worked on art projects in a brightly lit room. A woman named Maria, the program coordinator, gave me a tour, her enthusiasm contagious. "We're always looking for mentors," she said as we walked past a group of kids assembling a robot. "Someone to guide these kids, show them what's possible." I watched as one of the boys struggled with a piece of the robot, his brow furrowed in concentration. Another boy leaned over to help, their laughter filling the room when the piece finally snapped into place. "I think I'd like to help," I said, the words surprising even me. Maria smiled. "We'd love to have you." The weeks that followed were some of the most fulfilling of my life. Working with the kids wasn't just rewarding, it was healing. Their curiosity, determination, and resilience reminded me of the person I'd been before Olivia, before I'd let someone else's opinion define my worth. Through the program, I met other mentors, people who, like me, were navigating their own journeys of growth and rediscovery. One of them, a woman named Claire, stood out. She had an easy laugh, a kind demeanor, and a passion for helping others that was infectious. We started working together on a group project, and over time, our conversations extended beyond the center. Coffee turned into lunch, and lunch turned into long walks where we talked about everything from our favorite books to the lessons we learned from our past relationships. "I admire what you've done," Claire said one evening as we sat on a park bench, watching the sunset. "Walking away from something that wasn't good for you. It takes a lot of strength." I shrugged, a small smile playing on my lips. "It wasn't easy, but it was necessary." She nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "Sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the best outcomes." Her words stuck with me. While I wasn't ready to dive into another relationship, the idea of building something with someone who truly valued me felt possible. As the months passed, life began to take on a rhythm. Work was thriving, the mentorship program gave me a sense of purpose, and my mornings were filled with runs that cleared my mind and energized my body. The scars from my marriage hadn't vanished, but they no longer defined me. One evening, as I sat on the balcony of Caleb's apartment, sipping a beer and watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, I felt a deep sense of peace. My journey wasn't over, but I had come so far. The Nathan who once questioned his worth, who bent over backward to please someone who didn't value him, was gone. In his place was someone stronger, wiser, and finally free to live on his own terms. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my photos until I found the one I'd hung in my room. The snapshot of me on the hood of my first car, grinning with carefree confidence. "Welcome back," I whispered to myself, a smile spreading across my face. For the first time in years, the future felt bright, not because it was certain, but because it was mine to shape.